All right, so folks, this is kind of a tough one to take, as most of these Gaza stories are. But CNN did a report on the food shortage in Gaza, and they got some pretty astounding footage. That is, like I said, emotionally kind of tough to take. But here is a report from them.
In this ocean of desperation, a crush of bodies pressed against one another heave towards the same goal, a loaf of bread to survive. Wave after wave of distraught Palestinians at this bakery in central Gaza, fighting to feed themselves and their families before the day's bread runs out. Amid the shrieks and shoves, one girl clutches her precious cargo, struggling to keep her head above water. Inside the bakery, a vignette into the chaos outside. My hand, this woman shouts as her hijab is ripped from her head. Uncle, please, another girl shouts, struggling for air. Take the money, please, I beg you. But she is slowly being crushed by the crowd. Outside the bakery, the scale of the desperation becomes apparent. And this is just one bakery.
Yeah, just one.
The suffering here is unimaginable, Karam Mafana says. I've been standing for 4 hours trying to get a single loaf of bread. 4 hours, and I still can't bring bread home. For those who left empty-handed, there is nothing but uncertainty ahead. The World Food Program says all its bakeries in central Gaza have now temporarily shut down due to a lack of humanitarian aid entering the strip. For this woman's niece, it is already too late. What is the crime of this child? She is only 13 years old. Why did she have to go to a bakery and stand in this crowd? Zina was one of 3 people killed while trying to buy bread at that same Gaza bakery, crushed by the desperate crowd. Our bread is soaked in blood, the father of another victim says. Where did she go? How did she get in? How did she leave? I don't know. I only found her when they brought her out dead, he says. He simply cannot comprehend how his daughter could die while trying to buy bread.
And Alex, as the humanitarian situation in Gaza grows ever more desperate, very little seems to have been done to actually resolve those humanitarian aid bottlenecks in Gaza. But U.S. and Israeli officials say that in the wake of this ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, they believe that there is now an opening for a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas.
Yeah, so obviously we've heard excuse after excuse after excuse from Matthew Miller and the like. No famine or food shortage here. Don't believe your lying eyes or the press. Believe the Israeli army. And, of course, don't bother reading Michael Fakhri's report on starvation as a weapon of war. What does he know? So they link to that UN report. We'll read a little bit of that. Report of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food by Michael Fakhri. Starvation and the Right to Food with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. So we'll just go to some conclusions and recommendations. The graphic report, Palestinian People's Food Sovereignty, summarizes the specificities of the Palestinian people's food sovereignty and the universal struggle for the realization of the right to food. It's available on the website. The graphic report illustrates the following account. How states and international institutions are responding to Gaza is redefining the very nature of international law. In parallel, an extraordinary global wave of solidarity movements supporting the Palestinian people's right to self-determination is rolling across the world. Millions of people recognize that the tools and techniques that will free the Palestinian people from occupation, oppression, and exploitation will ultimately be the same ones that can free us all. By fighting Israel's starvation campaign against the Palestinians, people are in effect also fighting for their own freedom from hunger. Most of the world's populations suffer under food systems that harm or kill them through slower forms of violence than in Gaza today. The main challenge lies in stopping corporations and states from continuing to amass great amounts of power, which they use to manufacture scarcity and cause harm through food systems. Viewing the current war, quote unquote, from that perspective, we can understand that Israel is not defending itself against a terrorist organization, but is attacking the indigenous Palestinians as a people. This past year, Israeli settlers and armed forces inflicted record rates of violence against peasants and pastoralists in the occupied West Bank. As a result, peasants were not able to harvest their olives. Olives are, of course, an important source of food and livelihood. But the Palestinian people's relationship to olive trees, which can live for hundreds of years, is also about their relationship to their ancestors and their future, just as small-scale fishing is an integral part of a life of harmony with the sea and not only a means to gather food or foraging for wild zatar is not just a culinary choice, but a practice that retains an inherent connection to the land. So yeah, this is an important point, and this is why I wanted to read that little piece of the report there. We've heard it's common knowledge now that Israel controls the agriculture in Gaza, and we've seen reports going back years. We've seen on TV them excavating olive trees and plundering farmland and really waging a campaign of a very slow moving genocide in that sense for decades now. When you control a territory, when you control their water, their electricity, not only their food supply in terms of imports, but their ability to make their own food by destroying their crops, in this case, these olive trees, you are committing a slow-moving genocide against them pre-October 7th. And that has been happening going back years. And so now you're seeing just this apocalyptic horror unfold. But when he talks about here, what was that? I forget the exact phrase he used. What is it here? The right to food and food sovereignty. Yes, food sovereignty. The control over your resources, the relationship to your land, not only your land, but in this case, your waters, right? They're not allowed to fish their own waters. They can get shot at if the fishing boats go too far out. That is a mechanism of just an extreme control over a people that predates this genocide, quote unquote. And I use quotes not because it's not a genocide, but I use quotes because, as this report points out, you can really look back to pre-October 7th and say that the control over their food, their land, and their water was an act of genocide in and of itself. I think you can make that case pretty easily.
Well, when you look at all of the greatest atrocities committed, particularly in modern history, last few hundred years, the most deadly and horrific and toxic combination is for people with superior firepower, superior means, superior control of the state, to be convinced that they are under threat, that they are the victims of a weaker outside group, a weaker group that they see as outside themselves. If you can convince a population that a group that they have power over, that they have superior force to, is an existential threat to themselves, there is no horror that you cannot convince them to commit. And no people should understand that better than the Jewish people who suffered under such a regime in the Holocaust. And yet they have taken that horror and transferred the responsibility for it to a people that had nothing to do with it. You look at scenes like that, of that kind of horror. Can you imagine if a non-allied country were doing this?
Mm-hmm. Well,
the idea that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism, which I point out once again, we made the argument with Harris that whatever other argument you could make for that administration being the lesser of two evils, even if you bought into that, if genocide is not a red line for you, what is? So frankly, my patience for hang on, but this Trump pick, he's going to do really mean things to the deep state. my patience for that argument is very limited because nobody bought it with the Harris Biden people. You could have made a very good argument that they're going to be less hard on unions.
Right.
They're going to be less.
You could always pick an issue out. Yeah.
You could always say that. So if genocide was a deal breaker there, why isn't it here? Because across the board, everyone he's picking is a fucking Zionist maniac. Every last one of them, without exception. So is that not morally disqualifying? Because they're gonna make Fauci testify? That makes it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, then why didn't we just vote for Harris then?
Right. I mean, you could, like I said, if you could always pick an issue out and make it a priority and say, well, on this, I'm voting this. Right. This is about where your red line is. What is the line past
what
which
is
you
your
cannot
line?
go? Right.
Right.
Exactly.
So now we're just going to say, yeah, I don't like genocide. Well, so why didn't you say that about Harris?
Right. Then you're right back where you were before. You're right back where you were before.
Please clap.